World War I, 1918, the final year. As 1918 dawned, General Ludendorff and John von Hindenburg and the German High Command began to plan for the new year. They chose to ignore the facts that their U-boat campaign had failed and that the US had joined the war against Germany. Instead, General Ludendorff, in particular, looked at the hopeful aspects. Great Britain were exhausted by their efforts on the Third Battle of Ypres and Cambrai. The French were not capable of large offensive action for some time. The US would also need time to become battle-ready, and the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia had knocked Russia out of the war. Ludendorff and von Hindenburg could now transfer their troops from the Eastern Front to the Western, giving Germany a 192 versus 169 division superiority in the West. Again, Ludendorff in particular saw this as his chance to launch a major offensive and win the war. Ludendorff selected an area between Arras and St. Quentin, land that had been untouched by the winter and protected by the British, for the offensive. Extra German troops and artillery were transferred to the area, as 750,000 German troops would face 300,000 British troops, while Germany had 3/4 of its artillery facing the British, giving them a 3-to-1 advantage. Ludendorff also introduced new tactics by organising his attack forces in two groups, shock groups and follow-up attack groups. The shock troops would rush into battle first, break through the enemy lines and continue to advance without waiting for support, bypassing enemy strongholds. The follow-up troops would then come and attack the bypassed areas. Ludendorff also intended to use his artillery differently. He would use it to bombard the rear of the British positions first, knocking out command posts, headquarters and communication lines. Before then, turning it to the front trench. It was believed that this would make it easier for shock troops to advance once they had broken British lines. Interestingly, Ludendorff kept 1 million battle troops on the Eastern Front in attack formation, even though Russia had fallen out of the war, instead of transferring them to this battle, where they could have been used. Ludendorff wished to use these troops as a threat to the new Bolshevik leaders of Russia and get extra land from them in the peace negotiations. When the negotiations began, Germany made some very harsh demands of Russia, so harsh that the Bolsheviks refused to give up so much land and broke off negotiations. Ludendorff had taken charge of negotiations for Germany, then used 1 million troops to launch a massive offensive against Russia that brought Bolshevik leader Lenin back to the negotiation table. On March 3rd, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed by the two countries, giving Germany the Russian land of the Ukraine, Lithuania, Courland, Livonia and Poland, while also severing Finland from Russia. In one stroke, Russia lost 90% of its coal, 50% of its industry and 30% of its population. Ludendorff was required to keep the 1 million German troops in the east, as they had to occupy the new land as the people there were unhappy at being under German rule. Back on the Western Front, Ludendorff opened his offensive on March 21st, and his superior artillery allowed German shock troops to speedily break through British lines and into open country. They advanced 40 miles along a 50-mile front, the greatest advance by any nation since 1914. However, problems soon began as the shock troops were moving quicker than the artillery and as a result were having to fight without its protection and cover. Casualties and exhaustion amongst the shock troops were high, while Great Britain were rushing the French and US reserves as well as extra artillery to stop the German advance, which they did. Realising his offensive had failed, Ludendorff moved quickly to organise another offensive, using the same tactics in the north on the new dry ground south of Ypres. Again, he achieved early success before seeking the same problems, and the British were able to halt the advance. The Entente now made a change in their command structure. Generals Haig and Pétain remained in charge of the British and French armies, respectively, while French General Ferdinand Foch was placed in overall command of the all-Entente armies on the Western Front. This gave the Entente armies better planning skills and increased unity. Ludendorff next attacked French lines at Chemin des Dames, using the same methods and won spectacular gains, 40 miles in 3 days, bringing German troops in sight of Paris. Ludendorff wanted the French capital and called in extra German troops from up and down the Western Front to push on Paris. However, the French were holding strong with the help of US reserves. Ludendorff could not take Paris, but French and US troops were now tied down in its defence, so Ludendorff ordered another offensive in the north against the British, who could no longer call on French or US help, as they were protecting Paris. Ludendorff believed he now had the Entente in trouble. However, before this new offensive could be launched, Ludendorff received word of strange movements to the south. The Entente had launched a counter-offensive. It was now July 1918, and in 6 months, Germany had succeeded in capturing more ground than the Entente managed in 3 years. However, it created bulges in the German lines, and Ludendorff now had to defend a line that had doubled in length from 6 months earlier. Germany had lost 1 million troops in these 6 months, and the Entente had lost 900,000. The Entente counteroffensive began on the Marne River outside of Paris as French troops with 750 tanks advanced on the north flank of the German Bulge. Outnumbered 3-1, the German line retreated. At this moment, French troops attacked the south flank of the Bulge and pushed the German line all the way back to the Aisne River. Ludendorff rushed south to shore up his defensive lines as the French counterattack was halted. Pétain informed Foch that his French army was exhausted and could not continue offensive operations. Foch believed it was now time for Great Britain to launch an offensive in the north, as its army was now backed by a massive industrial strength that clearly dwarfed Germany's industrial strength. The gap between the two nations now reached crisis point for Germany. Haig launched Foch's offensive at Amiens on July 18th using the creeping barrage method and tanks to make small advances each day, always under the cover of massive artillery bombardments which nullified the German machine guns. The combination of creeping barrage, artillery and tanks came to dominate the Germans. In another change in strategy, Haig called off his offensive before it had finished, even though more land could be gained. This was a smart move, as Ludendorff had transferred extra German troops to Amiens, and any extra British advancement would take longer and have a higher rate of casualty. Instead, Haig launched other, similar offensive at different points in the German lines, pushing them hard until German reinforcements arrived and then attacking at another point. This method stopped Germany from being able to send reinforcements to one area to stop the Entente offensive. It now had to plug holes up and down the line as the Entente front was continuously moving east, step by step. By mid-September, the Entente powers had reached the German strong defensive line, the Hindenburg Line. The Hindenburg Line was a strong, sophisticated defensive system which was considered to be impregnable. In the south, the French and US troops moved against the Hindenburg Line with no success, while in the north, the British, Belgian, Australian and Canadian forces had found plans of the Hindenburg Line. The Entente found a section of line, 500 yards in length, that was weak and launched their offensive at that point. British artillery, backed by massive industrial strength, was able to land 126 shells per minute on this 500-yard section of the Hindenburg Line. Again, using the creeping barrage method, the Hindenburg Line was breached, but once the troops were out of range of the artillery cover fire, they halted and waited for the artillery to catch up before continuing with the offensive. It was now clear that Great Britain had developed a method to overwhelm the German defensive system, although it did not deliver a massive breakthrough, but rather only bite and hold results. So, from now until November 11th, the Entente powers continued a series of steady advances along their entire front. Ludendorff realised he could not stop this onslaught as he was in constant retreat, and he advised the Kaiser to seek a peace to end the war before the fighting reached German soil. As he realised the war on the battlefield was lost and the German home front crumbled, the Kaiser abdicated his throne and fled Germany as a revolution swept the nation. A new civilian, democratic government was installed and organised for a peace settlement as Ludendorff and von Hindenburg resigned. On November 7th and 8th, new German politicians secretly crossed French lines to begin armistice negotiations. With widespread strikes, revolutionary movements on the home front, and mutiny in the army. At 11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918, in a train carriage in the forest of Compiègne, the armistice was signed, and the war had come to an end. On a side note, in the south of Europe, the Austro-Hungarian army had crumbled without the support of the German army during 1918. Many non-nationals in the army simply went home, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire disintegrated. New countries, such as Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Croatia, and Slovenia, were born. In October, the Italian army attacked what was left of the Austro-Hungarian army, and when the Italian government believed they had advanced enough to claim great victory, they accepted Austro-Hungarian surrender.